Welcome back. This is 9.2 Objective B. We are on part 2. Part 2 is called the Reagan Revolution. His idea, if you remember from the first part of lesson 9.2, is Reaganomics, supply side economics. We have to cut taxes for the wealthy in order for it to trickle down. But here, we get into what this revolution is all about and what it means to be conservative in the 1980s. So, this is a two-part objective. Explain why conservatives argue liberal programs were counterproductive in fighting poverty and stimulating economic growth. And B, why some of their efforts to reduce the size and scope of government meets with inertia and liberal opposition. Under Reagan, there is an emphasis on smaller federal government. This has been a cornerstone in Republican and conservative ideology since the Reagan Revolution and since the rise of new conservatism, since the Great Society. The push is that we get the federal government smaller and we transfer some of that responsibility to the states. Critics were arguing that the Great Society programs that were put into place were very, very expensive, number one. And two, they were creating cyclical poverty, that people were just too comfortable where they were and they weren't working to get out of the poverty. So, number one, Reagan and the Great Society, he seeks to cut completely and or reduce the size of many programs in the Great Society. Several of these programs were after school programs involving after school, free and reduced lunch programs. And the after school programs, kids used to have a place to go, and then they started going and hanging out into the streets again. So in the 1980s, you start to see a rise of this inner city starting to fall, susceptible to decay, and also crack cocaine is introduced, kind of unrelated. But the social systems and the social network that was in place, the safety net to catch society, was vastly reduced under Ronald Reagan. He simply said they were too expensive. And inner cities, again, begin to sink into decay. Another minority group that suffers is the LGBT, because this is during the AIDS epidemic, and Reagan doesn't want to fund research because it's a gay disease in the 1980s. And many of the moral majority and the Christian conservatives kind of view it as, and they even said it's a disease brought on by God for their illegal and illicit behaviors. But that gets a little bit too far off the scope. He reduces Great Society programs is what you need to know, and there is a negative long-term impact on that. Moving on to number 2. Even though Reagan cuts Great Society programs, Reagan and the new right, the new Republicans, want to transfer the money that was saved into defense spending. This is at the very end of the Cold War. And remember, Reagan calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. So he wants to build up our nuclear arsenal. And he and his team create a program called SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. It is where we are going to have satellites in outer space, and our satellites are going to intercept and destroy Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. And because the movie Star Wars came out right before this plan was dubbed Star Wars. We spend money like it's no tomorrow. So even though we reduced government spending in some areas, like after school programs and other Great Society programs, we increase government spending, thus leading to a blooming federal deficit. Last but not least, many of Reagan's conservative ideas and goals fall short. Some of these Great Society programs, such as Social Security, are untouchable. You're not going to take away Social Security because the old people vote. Another one that is untouchable is the idea of Medicaid and Medicare. Those remain in place, and those are two of the larger safety net programs. So that wraps it up for our part 2, and we will see you in the next part.